Thanks for staying with us. Welcome to Across Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith, our weekly look at stories from across the continent. And this week, Africa's creative industries are having global clout, but talent is only part of the picture. The bright sparks setting music, film, fashion, social media alight need sustainable business structures and skills to keep their shows on the road. So I speak to Lora Mungai, one of the biggest advocates of Africa's artists, and she tells me all about the need for business dollars and cents and her new book that walks creatives through the financial practicalities needed to grow their gifts. Well, from Afrobeats to Nollywood to fashion, gaming, digital creators and streaming content, African creativity is increasingly acknowledged for how it has shaped and keeps shaping global culture. But turning that cultural capital into something sustainable that earns income and wider economic gains for the continent and individuals whose talent drive the creative industry is still a surprisingly tough exchange. A recent report on Africa's creator economy valued that sector at about $3 billion, with projections of more than $17 billion by 2030, but also found that most African creators earn less than $100 a month from their work. And creators are just one part of the continent's creative landscape. Now, the tension between visibility and viability is at the heart of Lora Mungai's new book, Creative Cash Flow. She's an entrepreneur, an investor, and a strategic advisor on Africa's creative industries and spent years helping investors understand where the real opportunities and obstacles lie. And I am lucky enough to have her join me for Across for this week. Marie, thank you so much for making the time to speak to me. I've been stalking you for a while now. And, I think a lot of the writing that I've come across, there's both a really tender appreciation of African talent, but you're also very no-nonsense when it comes to the realities about what it takes to make artistic enterprise work. So first of all, let's drill down into what you're talking about when you're talking about creatives and creators. What's the difference between those two terms?
Hi, Georgia. Yeah, thanks for having me. So the report that you mentioned earlier specifically focused on the creator economy, and that's one subsector only of what we call the creative industries. So the creative industries is really the combination of the wider list that you mentioned above. So that encompasses film, music, television, fashion, gaming. All of this is the creative industries. Among all of these subsectors, you find the creator economy, which is really the part of the industry that concerns digital creators, the ones we used to call influencers, so people who create content online and distribute it themselves through the various platforms that exist. This is the creator economy. So the numbers you mentioned of, about 60% of them only making $100 a day, these are digital creators. When it comes to the creative industries in general, that's not the case. You'll have, all sorts of types of structures and companies in there, from, individual freelancers, such as, let's say, a graphic designer operating on their own, to multi-million-dollar companies, such as a big fashion label or a cinema chain, for example. So these are, the important differences to keep in mind.
So one of the ideas that really struck me from the book was this idea that visibility does not equal viability, that you can be known, but that still doesn't translate necessarily into having the ability to have a sustainable business. For you, why is that such an important warning for the creative economy of the continent as a whole?
I think there's a lot of confusion, both from the creatives themselves and from people who are interested in getting involved in the sector, such as investors, between, as you said, visibility and viability. And you're in the media. I used to be a journalist, and we know that sometimes we can spotlight something that is interesting, but that doesn't mean that there's a sustainable business behind it. So really, having a large following, for example, or having press coverage doesn't mean that your business is stable and is growing and is profitable. These are completely different things. There's another term I use in the book, which is prestige poor. So it's really the situation where a lot of creatives are, getting a lot of notoriety. Maybe they're winning some awards, They're getting a lot of coverage in the press or on social media, but in the end, they're really struggling at the end of the month. And that's something that I've experienced myself while I was a creative entrepreneur. I very much was prestige poor. So we really have to be careful of that, because visibility is not what we're looking at if we want to grow a sustainable industry on the continent.
So what's your starting point? What do you think is the main gap when it comes to all of these people on the continent creating so many amazing, enjoyable, well-followed products, but that are struggling to actually balance their books at the end of the month?
Well, first of all, I don't think that this is really specific to Africa only. I mean, Africa is where I work, but I think that that's a situation that we could see in most creative industries across the continent, where very often these projects are actually led by the creatives themselves. And if you're a successful creative, it doesn't mean that you are a business person. Some can do both, but very few actually. So very often you'll find creative endeavors that are being led by somebody who has more a profile of an artist and is lacking the business or finance skills that you really need to grow from a one-person hustle into a sustainable business. So that's really the situation on the continent. Actually, if you look at small and medium businesses on the continent in general, 99% are one-person businesses. So it's not even a challenge just for the creative industries. It's a challenge for SMEs in general. But in the creative sector, the transition is even harder if the one person running it doesn't have these business and finance skills. So that's really what I've identified as the gap for the sector. And that's what I'm trying to plug with this book, Creative Cash Flow, which is really a book about business and financial literacy, but for creative entrepreneurs. So, written in their language with a lot of on the ground examples and case studies that make things very real.
It's really interesting. When we spoke earlier, you were saying that even if a lot of the models and the kind of mechanics that you touch upon in this book are applicable to the creative industries wherever, you were really struck at how there was nothing like this written about the African context. So beyond the universally applicable insights that are in the book, what do you feature that tailors it specifically to the African context?
Sure. I find that there's very few general concepts that are applicable. So you have basic things such as, what is a cash flow, what is a profit and loss document, and how to read a spreadsheet and these kind of things. But actually, building businesses in Africa in general and in the creative industries, I find is extremely different from the rest of the world. So I went to business school in France, and I've learned, all the main concepts and frameworks, such as the business model canvas, for example, which is a staple of business schools around the world, including in Africa. I don't find that it applies to African businesses at all. So what I do in the book is that I actually come up with new frameworks that are at the same time simpler, and at the same time very much based and grounded in the reality of the African context. And I'll give you an example. Business model frameworks that are taught in business schools, including in African schools, because we don't have African business books. They talk of situations where you have, for example, a stable currency or stable regulation, and none of this is the case in African markets. And there's a lot more volatility. And when you operate on an African market, whether it is Nigeria or Senegal or Kenya, you have to be a lot more flexible, and you have to develop some skills that are not needed in Europe, let's say. So that's really what the book is about. It's really about looking at what is the reality of building a creative business on the continent, and what are the best practices grounded in not just my own experience, but the experience of African creative entrepreneurs who have succeeded before.
Mm-hmm. You're at this really interesting nexus of, grassroots artists, then also, the big organizations, media organizations that kind of disseminate their work, but also bridging to external investors looking in. You were actually the moderator. I think some of the viewers might remember that buzz that was created at the Africa Forward summit in Kenya when French President Emmanuel Macron took the mic, and you were the moderator when that happened. But your very presence is in a way a representation of your links to that kind of external investor looking in to Africa. As much as this kind of grassroots advice that you're giving to African creatives, what are you telling external investors that they should bear in mind or do better when it comes to making the most of the African creative investment context?
Yeah, so my actual job, I run my own advisory firm that's specialized in the African creative and sports business, is actually to work with investors. So I work with very large development finance institutions, with private investors, and also with the large corporates to help them come up with their strategies to invest in their creative sectors in Africa, develop financial tools to do so efficiently, and then build deal flow and and find opportunities to invest. So that's actually what I do on a day-to-day basis. So my work is to talk with the investors. And basically, we've seen over the past 5 years a huge increase in interest on the part of these investors because of the success that African creativity and culture has found around the world, but also because they've realized that the African creative sectors were one of the few industries that were able to create a large amount of jobs, especially for the youth and for women, without enormous investment in infrastructure, although that is still needed. So basically in the past 5 years, I've worked with them to advise them on investing in the creative space. And that was quite successful because it led to a combined $3 billion being committed by these investors to the African creative industries. But now we're mostly sitting on that money because it's been very difficult to deploy it because of the lack of creative sector companies that are solid enough and structured enough and sustainable enough to absorb that funding. So that's really why I decided a year ago to write this book, is because I could see that the hurdle was no longer mostly on the side of investors who have caught on in their thinking, but mostly now on the side of the creative companies themselves that are still too small and they need help in scaling up so that they can receive that funding and continue to contribute to the growth of the continent.
Lora Mungai, thank you so much. Author of Creative Cash Flow, there talking us through about all the work and ambition that's gone into creating a handbook for African creatives, hoping to create the business foundations to make sure that their talent gets a platform it needs to keep going. Thank you so much for joining me for Across Africa, Marie. And thank you, audience, very much for joining me as well. Do so again if you can. Till then, take care.